In the heart of Accra, where wealth often moved behind tinted glass, and truth usually arrived late, the Kesse estate stood glowing beneath hundreds of warm golden lights, like a palace built not only from money, but from reputation, influence, and the careful performance of respectability. And on that night, the estate was hosting one of the grandest charity dinners of the season, an event filled with politicians, donors, business leaders, foreign investors, socialites, and every kind of powerful person who liked to be seen beneath chandeliers, while speaking softly about compassion over expensive cutlery and imported wine. Because that is how image works in cities like this. It dresses itself in generosity and teaches people not to ask too many questions about what happens in the kitchen, in the servants' corridor, in the payroll office, in the lives of the people who carry trays and wipe floors and vanish before the photographs are taken. Among those invisible workers moving carefully through the glowing hall was a young maid named Amara Nkrumah, 24 years old, dark-eyed, self-controlled, slight in build, but stronger than most people who looked at her would ever guess, dressed in a Navy service uniform with a white apron tied neatly around her waist, and her hair tucked beneath a plain headscarf. And she moved with the alert grace of a woman who had spent years learning how to do difficult work under pressure without drawing attention to herself. Because the poor learn early that being noticed is not always a blessing, especially in rooms built for the comfort of the rich. Amara had been awake long before sunrise that morning, before the estate's fountains were switched on, before the flower deliveries arrived, before the chefs shouted instructions across steaming counters, and before the first black cars rolled through the gates carrying guests with polished shoes and curated smiles. And since dawn she had ironed table linen until her shoulders ached, arranged cutlery until every fork sat in military straightness, polished serving dishes until she could see her tired face reflected in them, and carried box after box of glasses between storage rooms while supervisors rushed around, repeating the same nervous sentence in different words. Tonight must be perfect. Tonight nothing can go wrong. Tonight, no mistakes. Because wealthy men forgive corruption more easily than they forgive inconvenience. But for Amara, perfection was never about pleasing people like Solomon Kesse. It was about survival. About keeping the salary that paid for her mother's medicine, her younger brother Kojo's school fees, and the rent on the narrow one-room family flat where hope survived mostly because there was no room for despair to stretch out comfortably. Her mother, Abena, had been coughing blood on and off for months before finally receiving treatment. And though the doctors now spoke with careful optimism, optimism did not lower the cost of inhalers or clinic appointments or transport fares. And every cedi mattered. Her sister Essie sold fruit by the roadside under sun and dust, earning too little. Kojo was bright, disciplined, and old enough now to feel the shape of the family's struggle, even when nobody explained it aloud. And at the center of that fragile household stood Amara. Not because she had chosen such responsibility, but because life had placed it on her shoulders and kept adding weight until carrying it became the shape of her adulthood. While guests began arriving in gowns, silk wraps, tailored suits, and cologne expensive enough to feed a family for a month, Amara and the other staff lined up near the rear hall for final instructions. And the head steward reminded them again to keep their voices low, their backs straight, their eyes respectful, their movements efficient, and their existence almost decorative. Because the best service, in houses like this, is the kind that allows the powerful to forget service workers are people at all. Out in the main ballroom, the night unfolded in polished layers. A string quartet played near the marble staircase. Tall arrangements of white lilies and orchids rose from each table. Cameras flashed near the foundation banner, and donors spoke in measured voices about opportunity, development, and social responsibility, while waiters drifted through the room carrying canapés they themselves would never taste. And at the center of much of the attention stood Kesse, the only son of Solomon Kesse, heir to a construction empire that had reshaped roads, hotels, ports, and neighborhoods across the country. 30 years old, handsome in the effortless way of men who have always had people smoothing the world in front of them. Dressed in a cream tuxedo and a watch that caught the light each time he lifted his hand. Smiling broadly, laughing easily, moving through the room with the relaxed arrogance of someone who had never had to earn the kind of respect he received. Kweku had spent his whole life inside rooms that bent around his surname. School administrators had excused him. Managers had protected him. Women had been told to tolerate him. And older men had mistaken access for maturity and flattery for leadership. And over time, those soft protections had shaped him more deeply than anyone realized. Because when a person is raised without real consequences, cruelty often begins to feel like confidence, and contempt begins to sound like authority. From where she stood near the service entrance waiting for the next signal, Amara noticed him only the way one notices a chandelier, or a security guard, or a polished floor. Another feature of the house's power, another object around which she must navigate carefully. But she did not know, not then, that before the night ended, this man would single her out and change the direction of many lives, including his own. When the first course was cleared and tea service began, Amara was handed a large silver tray with fine porcelain cups and a matching pot of freshly brewed tea, and she moved slowly through the crowd, shoulders balanced, chin lowered, reading the shifting movements of guests the way workers in crowded spaces learn to do, stepping around laughter, sudden turns, careless elbows, handbags placed where no one else had room to stand, and all the small privileges rich people exercise without noticing them because they assume the world has been designed to make room for them. She was almost past the donor table when a broad-shouldered guest stepped backward while laughing at a joke. His cuff brushed her tray, one cup tilted, and a thin stream of hot tea splashed onto Kesse's sleeve and wrist. It was a minor accident, the sort of thing any decent person would brush off with a napkin and a shrug. Not enough to injure him, not enough to ruin the evening, barely enough to stain the cloth before a valet could replace the jacket entirely if he wished. But the room shifted anyway, because power is rarely waiting for a real injury before it chooses humiliation. Amara froze for half a heartbeat, then steadied the tray and said immediately, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm very sorry." Her voice low, sincere, controlled. And had the story belonged to an honorable man, that apology would have ended it there. But Kweku did not answer at once. He looked first at the tea on his sleeve, then at Amara's face, and something old and ugly surfaced in him. Not pain, not surprise, but the cold thrill of being publicly inconvenienced by someone he considered beneath him, and deciding, instantly, to turn that inconvenience into a spectacle. Nearby conversations slowed. The quartet kept playing. A few guests glanced over and then away again, sensing something unpleasant gathering in the air. Kweku reached across the refreshment table, his movements calm in a way that made them more frightening, and picked up the silver teapot still half full of steaming tea. For one brief second, Amara thought he might hand it back to her sharply, or set it down with contempt, or demand another cup, because even anger has predictable shapes. But what he did instead broke beyond anger into something smaller and meaner. He lifted the pot over her hands, where they gripped the tray, and tipped it. The tea poured across her fingers and the backs of her hands in a bright, scalding sheet. Pain shot through her so suddenly that her body jerked before her mind could catch up. A cup slipped, shattered against the floor, and a sharp breath escaped her lips. She tried not to cry out, tried not to give the room the full sound of what he had done to her. but her face tightened. Her shoulders trembled once, and the tray rattled in her grip. Several guests stared openly now. A woman in diamonds covered her mouth. A junior assistant took a step forward, then stopped when her boss touched her elbow. One security guard shifted his weight and looked toward Solomon Kesse as if waiting for instruction. But Kweku simply set the teapot down, adjusted his cuff, and said with flat disdain, "Next time be careful," as if he had corrected a faulty appliance rather than burned a living person. The cruelty of it was not only in the act itself, but in its calmness. The way he made public harm look administrative, routine, almost reasonable to anyone already trained to protect the powerful from moral scrutiny. Amara's hands were turning red before their eyes. Her skin throbbed as if fire had settled beneath it. Tears gathered instantly, but she held them there, refusing to let them fall in that room. Because workers like her know that once your grief becomes visible, people who ignored your suffering suddenly begin evaluating your composure instead. She bent with shaking fingers, gathered what remained balanced on the tray, and walked toward the service corridor while the guests, those polished patrons of charity, development, and social change, did what people so often do when faced with a cruelty they could challenge, but do not wish to interrupt their comfort over. They returned to themselves. The quartet resumed. A donor cleared his throat and continued his anecdote. Someone signaled for fresh wine. Two women whispered. A man laughed too loudly at something entirely unrelated. The room swallowed the moment as though silence could erase complicity. Yet one person at the far end of the hall did not look away and did not return to her meal. Nana Efua Ajiman, 78 years old, dressed simply in deep blue with a carved walking stick resting beside her chair, and eyes sharpened by decades of watching ambitious men call their appetites progress, had seen everything. Most guests knew her as the retired educator who had gone on to establish one of the country's most respected civic trusts. A woman whose opinions could still travel through ministries, newsrooms, churches, and corporate boards with unsettling speed. Fewer knew how deeply her quiet influence once ran through the networks that helped men like Solomon Kesse rise in the first place, or how much she disliked being underestimated. She had not attended the dinner for glamour. Solomon had invited her personally, and age had taught her that sometimes the most revealing truths appear in rooms full of polished lies. She watched Amara disappear through the service door, holding her burned hands as steadily as she could. She watched Kweku laugh again, already trying to recover his ease. She watched Solomon remain still, his face rigid in the terrible paralysis of a father who has just seen what his son is and has not yet found the courage to respond. Something in Nana Efua settled then. Not surprise, because nothing about the behavior of pampered men surprised her anymore. But decision. She rose slowly, excused herself from the table, and stepped into the rear garden, where the music was muted by stone walls and flowering hedges. Then called first a journalist she trusted, not for scandal, but for accuracy, and second, an old attorney named Daniel Ofori, to whom she said, in the measured voice of a woman who does not waste words, "Tonight I saw the inside of the Kesse house more clearly than they intended. By tomorrow morning, I want to know what kind of son that boy is, what kind of company has protected him, and who the young woman is that he burned in front of a room full of cowards." In the service washroom, Amara held her hands under cold running water and clenched her jaw so hard the muscles ached. The relief was immediate but shallow. Beneath it, the burn pulsed and deepened. Another maid urged her to sit, to tell the steward, to go home before the blisters rose. But Amara shook her head, because home contained rent and medicine and school books and not nearly enough money. And injured dignity did not qualify as emergency leave. She wrapped both hands in clean cloth, breathed until the shaking passed, and returned to the service line. Nobody in management asked what happened. Nobody needed to. In houses like this, the rules are often understood without speech. If harm comes downward from a powerful person, you absorb it. If you complain, you become difficult. If you become difficult, you become replaceable. And if you are replaceable, the world will teach you exactly how cheap your suffering is. So Amara finished the shift in pain, lifting plates with tender fingers, avoiding questions, keeping her face composed while heat traveled beneath the bandages and humiliation sat like a stone in her chest. When the last guests finally left and the final glasses were stacked away, she took the late staff bus home through streets emptied of traffic, past sleeping kiosks and shuttered shops, and arrived at the family flat after midnight. Inside, the room smelled faintly of menthol rub and boiled yam. Her mother slept on the narrow bed in the corner, breath uneven but calmer than before. Kojo's schoolbooks lay open on the table where he had fallen asleep studying. Essie had left food covered with a metal plate. Amara set down her bag, sat in the dark, unwrapped her hands, and looked at the angry red skin with an exhaustion too deep even for tears. Then, very quietly, so as not to wake anyone, she cried. Not like someone seeking comfort, but like someone making just enough room inside herself to survive the next morning. She cleaned the burns, applied ointment from a nearly empty tube, rewrapped her hands, and by sunrise, she had already decided she would return to work if they allowed her to. Because when poverty corners you long enough, endurance stops feeling heroic and begins feeling ordinary. Meanwhile, Daniel Ofori's inquiries were moving quickly. By dawn, he had found the photographer who captured the incident from across the hall. The video was less than 30 seconds, but painfully clear. The spill, Amara's apology, Kweku reaching for the pot, the deliberate pour, the way people watched and did nothing. Daniel also found other things, fragments at first, then a pattern. A former hotel receptionist who remembered Kweku humiliating staff during a launch event in Takoradi. A driver who hinted at drunken incidents paid away before reaching police. A junior HR clerk who had once been told not to log a complaint involving the heir. A contractor's daughter who said her father lost business after objecting to how Kweku treated workers on site. None of these incidents alone had brought him down. Men like Kweku rarely fall because of one act. They fall because one undeniable act gives shape to a history others were forced to carry alone. Daniel then asked the estate's personnel office for staff identification under pretext and found Amara's full name. Amara Nkrumah. Nana Efua stared at the surname for a long moment when he told her. Nkrumah. It stirred an old memory. She asked for the father's name and received it. Kwame Nkrumah. At once, the years folded backward. She remembered a principled compliance officer, serious, methodical, frustratingly honest, who had once challenged irregular compensation documents linked to one of Solomon Kesse's earliest development projects, insisting that displaced families be paid what they were owed, instead of being quietly cheated through shell vendors and revised land figures. Kwame Nkrumah had refused to sign altered papers. He had pushed, documented, argued, and in the end, been pushed aside, professionally isolated, then removed in a way that looked legal from far enough away and devastating from close up. Within a year, he was dead, his health broken, his reputation dimmed, his family left with almost nothing. And the company had continued growing atop foundations most people never saw. Nana Efua sat back in silence. The daughter of the man who once tried to force honesty into the Kesse empire had now been publicly burned by the son set to inherit that empire. Life, she thought, has a brutal memory, even when institutions do not. By midday, the video had begun circulating in private WhatsApp groups among event staff, journalists, activists, and eventually donors who recognized the ballroom immediately. It spread because the act was shocking, but also because it was familiar. Too many people had seen smaller versions of the same thing in kitchens, hotels, banks, private homes, and offices. The rich humiliating workers in plain sight because they assumed poverty came without witnesses. Within hours, radio commentators were discussing the tea video. Bloggers framed it as a class scandal. A labor rights organizer posted it with the caption, "This is what entitlement looks like when it stops pretending." Calls began reaching the Kesse group from sponsors, foundation partners, and government contacts asking whether the video was authentic. Solomon Kesse, who had barely slept, spent the morning with his phone vibrating across desk after desk, while handlers proposed statements about misunderstanding, unfortunate optics, and internal review. But he could not deny what he saw, because the truth had been visible from where he stood that night. More troubling still was the dossier Daniel Ofori arranged to place in his hands before noon. Not only the video, but testimonies, internal notes, and traces of earlier incidents that had been deflected, buried, minimized, or settled quietly around his son. Page after page revealed a pattern of arrogance nurtured by protection. Solomon read in cold silence. A contractor insulted in public. A waitress cornered and threatened after refusing Kweku's attention. A staff complaint marked sensitive and then closed without action. A driver paid severance after documenting inappropriate behavior. A club altercation hushed through family lawyers. Each page accused Kweku, yes, but also accused the machinery around him, the managers, aides, lawyers, relatives, executives, and yes, the father who had kept convincing himself that his son's worst instincts would mellow with age. When Solomon finally called Kweku into his private study, the morning light had shifted into something harsher. Kweku entered annoyed rather than frightened, still expecting irritation, not reckoning. He began with excuses before his father finished the first sentence. "It was an accident," he said. "Everyone was exaggerating," he said. "The girl had been careless, the media was hungry, people were jealous. These things happen," he said, repeating the language of men whose privilege has taught them that explanation is a form of escape. Solomon listened without interrupting, which unsettled Kweku more than shouting would have. At last, Solomon placed the open folder on the desk between them and said quietly, "Do not insult me by pretending this began yesterday." He spoke not as a businessman now, but as a man finally standing in the ruins of a lie he had helped build. He told Kweku what the reports showed, what witnesses said, what the video made undeniable. And then he said the one thing Kweku had never really heard from him before. "I have mistaken protecting you for loving you. And in doing that, I helped turn you into a man who mistakes power for permission." Kweku stared back, anger rising, then confusion, then a new and unfamiliar emotion. Fear, not of punishment exactly, but of not being rescued. By evening, the Kesse Group board had been called into emergency session. Executives who normally deferred to Solomon now spoke carefully about sponsor risk, public trust, governance failures, exposure, ethics, historical complaints, and structural accountability. The language of corporations is rarely moral at first. It speaks most fluently about risk. But risk, once named, can open the door through which truth enters. The board voted to suspend Kweku from all executive involvement, freeze discretionary accounts tied to company resources, review staff welfare systems, establish an independent oversight mechanism, and commission an external inquiry into mishandled complaints. Solomon approved every measure. Yet the most consequential decision came later, when he returned home and sat alone in the darkened study where portraits of his rise lined the wall like witnesses. He understood then that scandal management would not be enough. He called the trustees managing Kweku's access and ordered broader financial restrictions. He instructed legal counsel to reopen archived compensation claims connected to the old land dispute Amara Nkrumah had challenged. And most painfully, he instructed them not to shield his son from the consequences already in motion. Amara knew none of this the next morning when an unfamiliar car stopped outside her neighborhood and a professionally dressed woman stepped out asking for her by name. The woman introduced herself as Carol, assistant to Nana Efua Ajiman, and requested a private meeting. Amara's first instinct was refusal. Powerful people only seek out poor women unexpectedly for two reasons, she thought: to silence them or to use them. But something in Carol's manner was too careful to dismiss. And when Nana Efua herself received Amara later that day in a quiet sitting room lined with books and softened by afternoon light, there were no cameras, no promises, no theatrical sympathy, only tea, medical ointment, a doctor who examined the burns respectfully, and a conversation that changed how Amara understood not only the night before, but her entire family history. Nana Efua told her what she knew of Kwame Nkrumah: his integrity, his refusal to sign false records, his conflict with Kesse interests, the way he had been pushed aside and forgotten publicly while remembered privately by those who still valued a conscience. Amara sat very still as the story unfolded. All her life she had carried a faded version of her father, quiet, hard-working, dead too soon, defeated by life's ordinary harshness. Nobody had told her he had once stood against a machine larger than himself. Nobody had told her that his downfall was connected to the same family whose son had burned her. Her first tears that afternoon were not for her hands at all, but for the father she had not been allowed fully to know. "He was not weak," Nana Efua said gently. "He was inconvenient to men who needed silence." The sentence entered Amara like light through a crack. For the first time since the dinner, shame shifted direction. It no longer sat on her shoulders. It belonged elsewhere. Nana Efua did not pressure her. She simply laid out the truth, explained the legal options, and said that if Amara wished to file a formal complaint, there were people ready to support her. "You are not required to become a symbol," she said, "but you are also not required to disappear." Amara went home with documents, medicine, and a mind alive with grief, anger, and a new kind of clarity. That night she sat beside her sleeping mother and thought about all the ways poor families inherit silence. Not because they are naturally quiet, but because truth costs money, energy, and protection, and the powerful know exactly how to keep those costs high. By morning she had decided to file the complaint, not because she believed the world suddenly became fair, not because she trusted institutions, but because if she stayed silent now, The burn on her hands would not remain only her private pain. It would become one more brick in the wall protecting men like Kweku. Her statement triggered others. A former housekeeper described years of verbal abuse. A junior event planner admitted instructions were routinely given to manage optics around the heir's behavior. A porter from a Kesse hotel said he had been slapped for moving too slowly. A receptionist claimed a harassment complaint vanished after legal review. A driver provided dates, locations, and names. None of them had spoken earlier because each had believed they were alone. That is one of power's most useful tricks. It isolates the injured until they mistake a pattern for a personal misfortune. As the testimonies grew, public outrage deepened. Editorials began asking what charity means when the wealthy cannot recognize the humanity of those who make their events possible. Radio call-ins filled with stories from nannies, guards, caterers, secretaries, and hotel staff describing smaller humiliations they had endured in rich homes and offices. The tea video stopped being just a scandal and became a mirror. Sponsors withdrew. A foreign partner suspended talks. A civic award nomination linked to the Kesse Foundation was quietly rescinded. Reporters camped near the company gates. Statements drafted by consultants sounded hollow even before release. For the first time in his life, Kweku discovered that a surname could not instantly erase a consequence. His cards stopped working. Access codes failed. Vehicles were reclaimed. Friends offered sympathy without availability. Invitations disappeared. Women who once tolerated him publicly posted about worker dignity and accountability. Men who had laughed with him at clubs suddenly described him as unstable and reckless. He moved first into a serviced apartment, then into a much smaller rented flat near the freight district after broader restrictions cut deeper than he expected. The transition was not cinematic. There was no dramatic montage. Only the dull humiliation of downsizing without applause. He stood in queues. He carried his own groceries. He learned what a landlord's suspicion feels like when your surname no longer arrives ahead of you. He took temporary work through a contact who did not know him well enough to care about pedigree, and found himself in a shipping warehouse under fluorescent lights, logging consignments and moving cartons alongside men whose backs hurt for reasons no spa could solve. At first, he hated them for being ordinary around him, for not recognizing that he came from somewhere better. Then, gradually, as weeks passed and nobody deferred to him, something began loosening in the hard shell of his self-image. He heard coworkers discussing bus fares, sick parents, rent, school fees, night classes, and food prices with the matter-of-fact seriousness of people whose daily lives contain no safety net. He noticed how carefully they handled lunch portions, how often they sent part of their wages home, how tiredness lived in their shoulders, and how little room there was in such lives for vanity. For the first time, other people's burdens stopped appearing abstract to him. No revelation made him noble overnight. Shame alone does not improve character. But consequence can create silence, and silence, if a person does not rush to escape it, can eventually become understanding. Meanwhile, Amara's life was changing in ways both painful and quietly hopeful. Nana Efua connected her with a labor rights center that documented workplace abuse and advocated for low-wage employees who rarely had legal protection. At first, Amara came only to help with her own case, but those at the center noticed quickly how carefully she listened, how precisely she recalled details, how naturally frightened workers trusted her, and soon they invited her to assist with intake interviews. She sat across from hotel cleaners, domestic workers, receptionists, guards, caterers, and clerks who carried the same look she once carried into Nana Efua's house. A mix of caution, embarrassment, and desperate need. She helped them tell the truth in orderly steps. What happened? When? Who saw it? What was said? What was lost? What is needed now? She learned how reports are written, how contracts hide exploitation in polite language, how evidence protects memory, how institutions resist, and how persistence can pry small openings where justice, imperfect and incomplete, can still enter. For the first time, her survival skills were becoming tools rather than scars. Her mother's treatment improved when a medical support arrangement, quietly funded through civic networks Nana Efua helped activate, reduced the family's burden. Kojo remained in school. Essie expanded from a roadside tray to a small kiosk. These were not miracles. They were modest, practical changes. But to families who have lived too long on the edge, modest stability can feel revolutionary. Months passed. The inquiry into Kesse operations uncovered more than the board expected. Hidden settlements, ignored warnings, predatory supervisors, altered records, lax welfare systems. Several senior managers resigned before being dismissed. Solomon made a public address unlike any speech of his career. There was no polished triumph in it. He admitted, carefully but plainly, that a company reflects what it tolerates, and a father reflects what he excuses. That harm had been done under his roof and within his institutions, and that repair required more than image management. Cynics said he spoke only because exposure forced him to. They were not entirely wrong. But delayed accountability, when it creates real structural repair, still matters. Compensation mechanisms were established for some affected workers. Historical land claims connected to the old project were reviewed. An independent employee ethics board was created and chaired, after considerable persuasion, by Nana Efua herself. Solomon aged visibly during that season, not in dramatic collapse, but in the way men age when certainty leaves them. He worked with less swagger, listened longer, corrected more quickly, and carried in his face the burden of realizing success had cost more than he once admitted. Kweku, now months into his smaller life, sent a message through Nana Efua asking if Amara would meet him. She refused twice before agreeing, finally, to a brief conversation in a public cafe near the court complex, on one condition. He was not to mistake the meeting for reconciliation. He arrived early, wearing plain clothes that fit awkwardly on a man once styled by staff, his hands rougher now, his face leaner, his posture uncertain. When Amara entered, he stood instinctively, not out of performance this time, but nerves. She sat opposite him, ordered tea, and waited. The silence stretched. At last he said, "I know nothing I say can undo what I did." He did not rush. He did not blame drink, temper, pressure, scandal, the media, or childhood. He said he had spent months wanting to explain himself, and slowly realizing explanation was another form of self-protection. He said the truth was simpler and uglier. He hurt her because he could, because he had been trained by a lifetime of indulgence to treat inconvenience from poorer people as disrespect, and because he had never truly believed that someone in her position possessed a dignity equal to his own. "I am ashamed of the man I was long before that night," he said. "And if I am different now, it is only because the world finally stopped protecting me from seeing myself." Amara listened without easing his discomfort. Around them, cups clinked. A waiter passed. Afternoon light moved across the window. When he finished, he said the words he had once treated cheaply in others. "I am sorry." It was not theatrical. It was not enough. But it was real. Amara held his gaze and answered in a voice steady enough to wound him more deeply than anger would have. "Your apology is something you owe. My peace is not something you are owed in return." Then, after a pause, she added, "I hope you become someone better. Not to repair my life. For the sake of every person who will meet you after this." She stood, left money for her tea, and walked out with the same quiet dignity she had carried through the ballroom months earlier. Except now, she no longer carried it under humiliation. She carried it in freedom. Kweku remained seated for a long time after she left. He did not cry. Some grief comes colder than tears. He sat with the knowledge that consequence is not the same as redemption, that apology does not erase history, and that becoming less harmful is only the beginning of a life that may never fully balance what one has done. But for the first time in his life, he did not look for escape. He let the truth remain in the room with him. A year after the charity dinner, Accra had moved on to newer scandals, as cities do. But the lives most affected had settled into truer forms. Amara now worked full-time at the Labor Rights Center, no longer as a helper, but as one of its most trusted case coordinators. She wore simple professional clothes, kept her files in careful order, and had developed the calm authority of someone who knows exactly what dismissal sounds like because she has survived it. Workers came in frightened and left straighter-backed. She did not offer false hope. She offered precision, witness, and options. Her mother's health was stronger. Kojo passed his exams with distinction. Essie's kiosk hired a helper. Nana Efua remained a fierce ally, though never a patron in the insulting sense. She respected Amara too much for charity that stripped agency. Solomon continued reforming what he had once merely managed, aware that no speech or fund could fully correct the rot he had permitted, yet determined not to retreat into defensiveness. And Kweku kept working at the warehouse, then later in a junior logistics role, slowly learning habits of accountability that boys raised like princes should have been taught at 12. He was not beloved, not absolved, not restored to old comfort. But he was trying in the only way that mattered now. Quietly, consistently, without audience, without reward. Some nights he thought of that moment with the teapot and felt the memory physically, as if shame had its own temperature. He thought of how easily the room had allowed him to do it. He thought of Amara's face, not broken, not begging, simply wounded and dignified at once. He understood now that the strongest person in that ballroom had not been the heir, the donors, the security men, or even the father with the empire. It had been the maid with burned hands who refused to disappear. And somewhere in a bright, modest office above a noisy street, Amara sat one morning reading the statement of a domestic worker, dismissed after reporting abuse in a wealthy household. Sunlight touched the edge of her desk. Outside, traffic moved, vendors called, engines coughed. Life went on as it always does, indifferent and miraculous at once. The worker across from her trembled while speaking. Amara handed her water and said the words she had once needed but never received that night in the ballroom. "What happened to you matters. Start from the beginning. I am listening." And perhaps that is where the truest ending lives. Not in punishment alone, not in public shame, not even in apology, but in the moment a person once treated as invisible becomes the one who refuses to let others vanish. Because wealth can purchase comfort, silence, and delay. It can build estates, influence headlines, and train rooms full of people to look away. But it cannot manufacture dignity. Dignity lives elsewhere. It lives in tired hands that keep working, in truth spoken after years of pressure to remain quiet, in grief that becomes clarity, in survival that becomes service, and in the stubborn refusal of the wounded to accept the names powerful people try to give them. On the night Kesse poured hot tea onto Amara Nkrumah's hands, he believed he was reminding her of her place. What he did not understand was that her place had never been beneath him at all. It was history that sat beneath both of them, memory beneath both families, and a moral reckoning already moving toward them through witnesses, through old files, through the father's unfinished sins, through the city's hunger for a truth finally visible. By the time he understood that, the tea had long gone cold, the cameras had done their work, and the woman he tried to humiliate had already begun becoming someone far greater than the role he assigned her. And that, more than the scandal, more than the money lost, more than the boardroom consequences or the public disgrace, was the deepest judgment on the man he had been. That the person he tried to reduce became, through pain and courage, more fully human than he had ever learned to be.